Hello and welcome back to A Rose Within the Thorns, the vodcast where we discover the beauty within powerful literature and explore how stories help us connect, reflect, and grow. In this episode, we walk with Eliezer through his first hours inside Birkenau. Section 3 of Night is arguably the most devastating chapter in the book. It marks the moment when identity begins to dissolve, faith begins to fracture, and innocence is consumed, literally and symbolically. Let's start with our section summary. As Eliezer and his family step off the train at Birkenau, they are met with commands that sound deceptively simple. Men to the left, women to the right. These 8 words, delivered indifferently by an SS officer, are the last Eliezer hears before being separated from his mother and sister forever. He will never see them again. In the confusion, another prisoner tells Eliezer to lie about his age, say 18, not 15, and tells his father to say 40, not 50. These small deceptions may save their lives during the first selection, where Dr. Mengele and others assess which prisoners are deemed fit to work and which are not. As the group marches towards what they believe may be their deaths, they see flames. Babies are being thrown into fire, adults too. The air smells of burning flesh. It's not symbolic, it's real. A man begins to recite the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, not for others but for themselves. Eliezer, overwhelmed, begins to lose faith. He questions the silence of God, the apathy of the world, and the meaning of prayer in the face of atrocity. Just steps from the crematorium, their line is redirected into the barracks. But the suffering continues. They are stripped, shaved, disinfected, and given numbers. Eliezer becomes A7713. His name is no longer his own. A few glimmers of connection shine through. A cousin, Stein from Antwerp, finds them. Eliezer lies to him, saying that Stein's family is alive, offering false comfort that keeps him going, until he learns the truth and vanishes. By the end of this section, Eliezer has stopped praying. He feels his identity, religious, moral, and personal, dissolving. His reflection on that night is one of the most searing passages in Holocaust literature. Never shall I forget. Moving into our theme talk, we're going to look at 3 themes today. Firstly, the loss of innocence and the collapse of identity. In section 3, Wiesel presents Eliezer's identity not as something stable, but as something susceptible to erosion under extreme suffering. The representation of identity here is both physical and spiritual. Eliezer's name is replaced by a number, A7713. His body is shaved, stripped, disinfected, and clothed in a uniform. These changes are not just practical. They symbolize the transformation from person to prisoner, from subject to object. The quote, "I too had become a different person. All that was left was a shape that resembled me," is laced with metaphorical language and fragmented imagery. It reflects not only Eliezer's personal loss of self, but the broader representation of the Holocaust as a machinery of dehumanization. The use of shape instead of self signifies that identity is no longer intact. It had been broken, blurred, or hollowed out. This collapse is also temporal. Time itself becomes disorienting. Eliezer says he no longer knows if it has been days or hours. Wiesel is disrupting conventional narrative time, reflecting the chaos of lived trauma. In doing so, he invites the audience to inhabit the psychological experience of prisoners, where past, present, and future blur into a single overwhelming now. This cultural assumption of childhood as a protected, sacred time is shattered. Wiesel offers a deeply ironic contrast between the child scholar who once wept during prayers and the young man who watches babies being thrown into the flames. This challenges the reader to reconsider what it means to grow up when that growth is forced through terror. Eliezer is not just a narrator here, he becomes a symbol for all children of the Holocaust who were robbed of their future. His identity unravels publicly, and Wiesel ensures that we witness every thread being pulled loose. Our next sub-theme, the erosion of faith in God and humanity. The Holocaust is not just a physical atrocity, it's a spiritual one. Wiesel foregrounds a crisis of faith, not in the existence of God, but in God's justice. Eliezer's haunting line, "Why should I bless his name? What had I to thank him for?" articulates a cultural and theological rupture. For centuries, Jewish tradition has emphasized suffering as a test of faith. But in Auschwitz, this logic collapses. Eliezer's experience challenges the audience to grapple with this paradox of divine silence. Wiesel uses internal monologue and rhetorical questions to represent this moment not just as a theological doubt, but as a betrayal, a disruption of covenantal belief passed down through generations. This loss of faith is paralleled by a loss of faith in humanity. When Eliezer witnesses his father being beaten and does nothing, Wiesel presents a powerful moral conflict. It's not just that Eliezer is afraid, it's that the world has taught him that compassion has consequences. This moment reflects the ethical distortion imposed by terror, where self-preservation silences moral instinct. Thematically, Wiesel shows that under extreme cultural breakdown, values such as familial protection, honor, and respect, particularly central in Jewish tradition, becomes distorted. The audience is positioned to feel both horror and guilt, not just because of what is happening, but because how people, perhaps even ourselves, might behave under such conditions. Aesthetic features such as juxtaposition, that view of Eliezer's inner guilt versus his outer silence, irony, and tone all work together to critique both religious and human failure within this section. Wiesel resists offering moral absolutes. Instead, he invites his audience into a space of reflection, not judgment. Our third theme is that of memory and the duty to bear witness. The passage beginning, "Never shall I forget," is one of the most powerful literary and moral moments in the entire text. Wiesel employs anaphora, the repetition at the start of each line, to build a rhythm that mirrors religious liturgy, specifically the cadence of Jewish morning prayers. Yet this is no traditional prayer. It's a radical reworking of sanctity, where remembrance replaces praise. This litany transforms trauma into testimony. The flames that once consumed bodies are now fused with the metaphor, "those flames that consumed my faith forever." Faith, identity, family, all burn. But what remains is memory, and Wiesel positions that memory as both burden and weapon. In doing so, he repositions the reader. We're not just observers, we're witnesses. By refusing to forget and insisting on remembering, Wiesel forces us into the role of post-Holocaust moral inheritors. The audience must carry forward what others could not survive to say. This aligns with the post-war cultural value of never again. But Wiesel deepens it. He doesn't want remembrance to be comfortable. He wants it to sting, to ache, and to stick. Moreover, this section blurs the line between memoir and liturgy, between personal narrative and collective memory. Wiesel elevates his pain into sacred text, not for divine praise, but for moral reckoning. The effect of the stylistic device is that the reader is spiritually implicated. Forgetting is not an option. Through these themes, Wiesel constructs a series of confronting perspectives. Firstly, the child who becomes a number. Secondly, the believer who begins to curse silence. And lastly, the witness who refuses to let memory die. Each of these perspectives challenge cultural assumptions that children are protected, that faith will provide answers, and that suffering is redemptive. Wiesel does not affirm these beliefs. He interrogates them, holding them against the light of atrocity to see if they still stand. Audiences are not merely reading about the Holocaust, they're being positioned to ask themselves questions about their faith, their societies, and their responsibilities. Wiesel's memoir is not only a record of what was lost, it was a testament to what must be remembered and what must never be allowed to happen again. We're now moving on to our quote collections. Our first quote: 8 words spoken quietly, indifferently, without emotion. Wiesel reflects on the moment that his family is permanently torn apart when the SS officer coldly commands men to the left, women to the right. This tricolon, this breaking up of the sentence, quietly, indifferently, without emotion, captures the casual brutality of that command. There's no yelling, there's no spectacle, only this calm bureaucracy. Through understatement and irony, Wiesel shows that the most life-altering trauma can be delivered in the softest tone. Evil does not need rage. It functions most terrifyingly when it feels like routine. Wiesel critiques the Nazi system of dehumanization here as not just violent, but efficient and emotionless. He deliberately chooses not to dramatize the separation, but to expose the everyday tone. Readers are positioned to understand how totalitarian systems don't need chaos. They rely on indifference. By doing so, Wiesel highlights the emotional dislocation that occurs when language is used as a tool of destruction. The audience is left with a sense of powerlessness and outrage, not just at what was said, but how little it seemed to matter to those who said it. Our next quote: "Never shall I forget that night. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever." In this famous passage, Wiesel lays anaphora, that repeated phrase, "never shall I forget," to mimic the solemn cadence of Jewish morning prayers like the Kaddish. But rather than pray for the dead, Wiesel is testifying to a death within himself, the death of faith, innocence, and belief in divine justice. The flames that consumed the bodies also consume his trust in God. The poetic structure here, devoid of punctuation at key points, mirrors a choked breath, an outpouring of trauma too vast for typical syntax. Wiesel deliberately echoes religious ritual here, while rejecting its source, God. The juxtaposition of spiritual form with spiritual loss represents a central tension of the memoir. The audience is invited not just to mourn with him, but to adopt memory as a form of resistance. Wiesel is not just remembering, he's commanding us to remember. His repetition becomes a protest against both forgetting and the silence that allowed these atrocities to occur. The audience is no longer passive here. They're implicated in the duty to bear witness, a central theme within this text. From the pit, an infernal heat was rising. This line uses sensory detail to plunge the reader into the physical horror of the crematorium. The phrase infernal heat conjures this image of hell, evoking biblical illusion and moral inversion. Hell is no longer a religious abstract. It's a geographic, immediate, and human made. By using the word pit, Wiesel evokes Old Testament punishments and prophecies of damnation. But here the victims are not sinners, they are the innocent. Wiesel redefines hell as a historical and political reality. This is not a place of symbolic punishment, but of literal genocide. Readers are forced to confront the moral bankruptcy of a world that allowed such a place to exist. Wiesel positions the audience to see the Shoah not just as a tragedy, but as the death of spiritual and moral order itself. The effect of one is nausea, disbelief, and most importantly, responsibility. My soul had been invaded and devoured by a black flame. Wiesel describes the spiritual toll of his experiences using the metaphor of a black flame, a force that invades and consumes. Fire, as we know, is traditionally associated with the purification or divine presence. It's now being transformed here to a symbol of destruction and internal decay. The flame is personified as something alive, malicious, and all consuming. The color black also symbolizes hopelessness, death, or the obliteration of light. His soul is not wounded, it's eaten alive. This quote shifts the narrative form to existential destruction. We move away from physical survival. Wiesel wants the reader to understand that trauma is not confined to the body. He represents the Holocaust as a system that colonized the interior self, burning away belief, purpose, and identity. Through this metaphor, Wiesel critiques the way that trauma corrupts the psyche and challenges audiences to reckon with the emotional legacy of genocide long after liberation. We were walking slowly, as one follows a hearse, our own funeral procession. This powerful simile captures the psychological death of prisoners. Though alive, they're made to feel like they're already dead. The comparison to a funeral procession suggests not only despair, but a total loss of agency. By describing their own movement as mourners of themselves, Wiesel turns their march into a ritual of self-burial. It's one of the clearest representations of how Nazi terror systematically destroyed hope and humanity. Wiesel employs this image to evoke a sense of slow, deliberate annihilation. It's not sudden or explosive, it's heavy, drawn out, and mournful. The line positions the audience to understand that the Holocaust worked through anticipation and paralysis. Readers feel the tension, the grief, and the unbearable not knowing. It speaks to how victims were made complicit in their own erasure, not through choice, but through powerlessness. There it was now, very close to us, the pit and its flames. The language here, there it was now, signals a shift from rumor to reality. The danger is no longer an idea, it's physically present. Wiesel's short sentence structure here and lack of embellishment reflect the shock and resignation of a mind that's overwhelmed. He does not scream or moralize, he points. The horror, he implies, speaks for itself. Wiesel uses language sparingly here to mirror emotional numbness. He does not ask the reader to imagine, he demands that they look. The phrasing positions us within the scene. We're no longer readers, we are witnesses, standing behind Eliezer on the brink of the unthinkable. What a shame that you didn't go with your mother. I saw many children your age go with their mothers. Spoken by Eliezer's father, this line is devastating in its quiet grief. It reflects the inverted moral logic of Auschwitz, where death with family seems preferable to living alone. The line carries tragic irony. Survival has not brought relief, but survivor's guilt. Elieser's father's tone here is not bitter, but it's filled with resignation, a passive acknowledgement that survival itself has become a curse. Wiesel shows how love can coexist with despair. The line underscores a terrifying idea. In the death camps, even family bonds are no refuge. Readers are positioned to question the very framework of moral choice and to understand that being alive does not mean being saved. We no longer clung to anything. The instincts of self preservation, of self defense, of pride had all deserted us. This line captures the moment of psychological surrender. The tricolon, that break up between three sections, builds momentum, each clause naming a human instinct that has been lost. The listing mimics exhaustion and hopelessness. It shows that what has been taken from the prisoners is not just their freedom, but the very mechanisms of survival and identity. Wiesel's use of stark, final phrasing presents the Holocaust not as a singular act of murder, but as a slow, calculated erosion of the human spirit. This line speaks to the systemic stripping away of will, and it positions the audience to reflect not on how people die, but how they're made to stop living. We're now going to go through the reflective questions. I strongly recommend you pause here and have a go answering some of these questions so you can listen to the example response to see how well you are familiar with the text. Our first question: how does Wiesel represent the emotional and spiritual effects of the first selection? What does this moment suggest about the collapse of identity? Wiesel represents the first selection as a moment of profound psychological rupture, where identity, family, and faith are fractured in an instant. The line, 8 words spoken quietly, indifferently, without emotion, encapsulates the clinical dehumanization of Nazi authority. This moment is not framed with dramatic flourish, but with bureaucratic indifference, symbolizing how human lives are reduced into categories. The separation of Eliezer from his mother and sister is described in emotionally muted language, mirroring the disassociation experienced by the victims. Identity collapses not through physical pain, but through the severing of familial bonds and cultural norms. In this way, Wiesel represents Birkenau not just as a place, but as a psychological landscape where everything familiar disintegrates. Culturally, this moment challenges deeply held Jewish values around family, protection, and community. The Holocaust dismantles these traditions, replacing them with fear and disconnection. Readers are positioned to feel the emotional vacuum left behind. Through understatement, irony, and focalized perspective, Wiesel invites us to witness not just the historical horror, but the inner death, that comes before the physical one. Our second question: in what ways does the aesthetic structure of Never Shall I Forget reinforce Wiesel's moral message? And what does repetition achieve here? The Never Shall I Forget passage employs anaphora, a stylistic device which a phrase is repeated at the start of successive lines. This repetition mirrors the structure of sacred Jewish liturgy, particularly morning prayers. Yet Wiesel subverts their traditional content by pairing spiritual form with devastating imagery. Rather than remembering a loved one, Eliezer remembers the moment his faith, identity, and sense of humanity were incinerated. The repetition reinforces Wiesel's moral message that memory is both a form of resistance and a moral imperative. He refuses the reader the comfort of closure or redemption. Instead, we're drawn into a litany of grief that must be endured, not resolved. The aesthetic rhythm anchors us in reality that these horrors are not momentary, they persist in memory, culture, and conscience. Wiesel's perspective here represents the trauma not just of a single person, but of an entire people. Readers are invited to take up position of witness, inheriting the responsibility to remember in his place. As mentioned before, the text becomes more than a memoir. It becomes a testimonial literature in which form and message are inseparable. Our third question. Why do you think Wiesel includes the moment where Eliezer fails to defend his father? What does this say about survival, guilt, and change? Wiesel includes Eliezer's failure to intervene when his father is beaten as a confronting admission of moral and emotional decline. I had not even blinked is jarring because it contrasts so starkly with early representations of Eliezer as a devoted son. Here, Wiesel explores the concept of survival at the cost of humanity. This representation challenges traditional cultural values around familial protection and masculinity, especially within the Jewish context, where familial responsibility is deeply embedded. The inclusion of this scene serves to deconstruct romanticized notion of heroism. Instead, Wiesel presents a realistic psychological transformation under extreme duress. Through Eliezer's voice, readers encounter the emotional numbness and ethical erosion that accompanies prolonged trauma. The moment is rendered in sparse, unadorned language reflecting the deadening of emotional response. Wiesel's intent is not to evoke judgment but reflection. Audiences are positioned to understand that survival in such conditions often require compromise and that guilt becomes an inevitable residue. The change in Eliezer represents a loss of not just innocence, but moral certainty. Our fourth question. How does the imagery of fire function within this section? And how does it connect to earlier representations of fire in the text? Fire functions in this section as a recurring motif of destruction, desecration, and transformation, deepening the symbolic pattern established earlier in the previous section. In section 2, fire is introduced through Madame Schechter's visions, where it is dismissed as madness. In section 3, her vision becomes reality. Wiesel writes, "From the pit an internal heat was rising," using hellish imagery to represent the crematorium as a literal and spiritual underworld. Fire no longer purifies, it annihilates. In Jewish tradition, fire is often a symbol of divine presence. We know from that example of the burning bush or the eternal flame. Wiesel deliberately inverts this cultural symbol, showing how the Holocaust corrupted even the most sacred imagery. The flames that once represented holiness now consume innocence, children, faith, and memory. Through this imagery, Wiesel challenges audiences to confront the moral inversion of the Holocaust. The reader is positioned to feel the psychological torment of witnessing familiar bonds become tools of horror. Fire connects the physical setting of Birkenau to the emotional setting of Eliezer's soul. What burns in the pits is mirrored in the black flame that consumes him from within. And our last question. What role does silence play in this section? Both God's silence and Eliezer's own. Silence in this section operates on multiple symbolic levels. Firstly, God's silence becomes this central tension. When Eliezer sees children burned alive and asks, "Why should I bless his name?" he articulates a theological crisis. The divine has become absent at the very moment it is most needed. Wiesel represents this silence not as an absence of sound, but as an absence of justice, mercy, and moral order. Eliezer's own silence, particularly when his father is struck by a capo, adds another layer. His inability to act becomes symbolic of the way that oppression disables moral response. It shows how silence can be a symptom of survival, but also a source of guilt. His silence marks the beginning of his loss of voice, emotionally, spiritually, and narratively. From here on, he speaks less with certainty and more with brokenness. Stylistically, Wiesel often omits dialogue or reaction in these moments, choosing stark narration instead. These aesthetic choices mirror the emotional numbness of trauma. Silence, therefore, is not an absence, but it is a presence. It echoes louder than any scream. Readers are invited to reflect on the danger of silence in the face of injustice, a message Wiesel would carry into his post-war activism. The text presents silence as both survival mechanism and an ethical warning, positioning the audience to consider their own role as speakers or bystanders in the face of human suffering. In this episode, more than any before it, it exposes the core of Wiesel's grief, anger, and survival. Section 3 is not just a record of events, it's a record of loss, of family, of faith, of moral certainty. And yet it is also a testimony. Wiesel writes so that we will never forget. And if we remember, maybe we can prevent silence from falling again. In our next episode, we'll follow Eliezer and his father into a camp where cruelty becomes routine and survival becomes negotiation. Until then, keep questioning, keep thinking, and most of all, keep reading. I'm Mr. Rose, and this is A Rose Within the Thorns.